everyone. I'm Mike Clark. I am with the Social Innovations Partners. I'm going to be talking today to you and with you about the Greater Philadelphia College rankings, why we did these rankings, how we calculated the rankings, and what are some of the takeaways, what are some of the implications from a ranking like this. So why we did these rankings? We did the Greater Philadelphia College rankings to create a ranking system that would appeal to the average Philadelphia resident, that had criteria that the average Philadelphia resident would really care about, things like affordability, social mobility. If I go to a college or a trade school or a community college, will I get a good job afterwards? Things like graduation rate, class size, that again would have value to the average college resident. Philadelphia resident, excuse me. We also looked at indicators that not only would the average resident agree with, but also indicators that we removed some of the indicators from traditional rankings like U.S. News and World Report that limited accessibility to college. For example, how selective a school is. What is the school's endowment? What are the financial resources for the faculty? Again, we wanted to make this as relevant as possible to the average Philadelphia consumer, whether they be a parent, a student, a guidance counselor. It's also apparent to us at the Social Innovations Journal that colleges are drivers of economic mobility. And we wanted to create a ranking that reflected that. So we included not only colleges and universities, but also trade schools and 2-year schools and 4-year schools to really create a ranking that reflects economic mobility and the drivers of economic mobility. So what criteria did we use to create this ranking? So what criteria did we use to establish these rankings? We used affordability, which we weighted at 35%, social mobility, which I'll talk more about the indicators later, which we weighted at 30%, graduation and retention rates, we weighted at 25%, and class size, we weighted at 10%. We used 13 total indicators, which I'll get into at the next slide. All data that we used is publicly available. If you have an interest, you can go and research some of the sources that we use. They're incredibly interesting. I highly recommend digging into some of them, especially the Equal Opportunity Project, which is led by Dr. Raj Chetty, which was mentioned earlier in an earlier presentation. I also highly encourage looking at the U.S. Department of Education's data. They have a lot of data sets on this, on college access and college affordability and college mobility. There's a nice index called the Social Mobility Index that is put out by a company called CollegeNet. They also do a really nice job. And we also used a website called Niche, niche.com, which is a big data website, mainly for consumers, not only around college data, but also housing data, neighborhood data, things like that. But they have a really nice user-friendly website around a lot of this college data. So these are some of the sources that we pulled our indicators from. And without further ado, here are the indicators that we used. In affordability, we used tuition, the sticker price of attending a university or a college, the average net cost per year, the average loan per student per year. In the category of mobility, we use the percentage of low-income students attending a college, university, or trade school, percentage of Pell-eligible students, early career salary, mid-career salary, 2-quintile mobility, meaning students that have moved 40% in income up from their parents, what their parents made nationally. And then we also used bottom to top quintile mobility, which the Equal Opportunity Project defines as mobility rate, and that is students who moved to the top 20% of income after their parents were in the bottom 20%. We also used percentage of Pell eligible students that have made it into the top 50% of income. So those were the indicators that we used for the mobility category, again, which we weighted at 30%. Graduation and retention rate, we combined those two indicators for the colleges, universities, and trade schools, graduation rate and retention rate. We used those two indicators. And then for class size, which was at 10%, that's student to teacher ratio. So those were the indicators that we used, 13 in total, to come up with the overall ranking. And we also ranked them by category. So I encourage you to look at the category rankings as well. Some general takeaways. Generally, there's a trade-off between affordability and social mobility, graduation rate, and class size. So the more affordable a school was in general, the less that we saw in terms of social mobility rates and graduation rates and class size. I think on one hand, a lot of the schools that scored very high in affordability can work on those other categories, and the schools that scored very high in the three other categories can really work on making their schools more affordable. And then that's in general. There's schools that balanced the two very well, and those schools ended up more towards the top of our ranking. Again, the categories here might be more informative than the overall ranking. So if you look at the categories themselves, pick out which category is most relevant to you as a consumer or as an institution, and look at the rankings based off whether they're the mobility category or the graduation rate category. And that could be a bit more informative than the overall ranking. You really want to get a little bit more nuanced view of where schools fell based off of the indicators that we set. I really think the future of these rankings are a bit more dynamic. They're not static in nature. I think as we move forward, we'll be able to personalize rankings and customize rankings based off of a student's background, their geography, their intended major, the list of schools that they're looking to apply to, the percentage chance that they'll actually get into those schools. So again, selectivity is a big issue that we see in some of these other rankings. Institutions really should consider measuring towards outcomes, social mobility outcomes. So being very intentional in their strategic plans and the way that they commit resources to moving students up the economic ladder, because another takeaway here is that students and universities and colleges and trade schools, these institutions do move people up the economic ladder. There's no question about it. So how can we do better? How can we do more? Colleges really are inflection points for economic mobility. And finally, I'd just like to say that no ranking is perfect. We tried our best here to capture a ranking that would be most relevant to Philadelphia residents, consumers, and also nudge institutions a bit to consider indicators such as social mobility and affordability. Thank you.